Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Today was supposed to be the day we left the European Union. Instead, the general election got underway in earnest as Jeremy Corbyn launched the Labour Party's campaign. He vowed to transform Britain and take on what he called the establishment elite. He also said he would get Brexit sorted in 6 months. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister expressed his frustration that Britain wasn't leaving the EU today, but said he would deliver Brexit by the end of January at the absolute latest if the Tories win. Our political editor, Laura Kuensberg, is in Westminster for us now. Laura.
Well, Sophie, the election date only became official and became law this afternoon when it was given a rubber stamp by Parliament. But it feels really now that this is well underway. Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson, the contenders to be our next Prime Minister, and they are in lots of ways chalk and cheese, night and day, with completely clashing visions on Brexit and the kind of country that they would like to create. But there's something strange too. They are both happy campaigners. They have that in common, being away here from Westminster and out talking to people around the country. And the Labour leader looked absolutely delighted to be back on the road this morning.
A roar of welcome for their hero, whose second time round reckons he has a chance to be a champion, not just the challenger. In this election taking place because we have not yet left the EU.
Today is the 31st of October, the day that Boris Johnson promised we would leave the EU. But he has failed, and that failure is his alone.
If they won, Labour would hold another referendum and maybe leave, maybe stay. So they want to campaign on more familiar ground.
Despite his denials, the NHS is up for grabs by US corporations in a one-sided Trump trade sellout. I simply say quite bluntly to everyone, it's not for sale.
The Tories do not have plans to trade away the health service, but that won't stop this chant.
Not for sale.
The Labour leader knows he's on to something. Manna from heaven in a room like this.
It is now time for real change.
Mr. Corbyn, your pitch to the public today is very similar to in 2017. Why do you think 2 years on you might secure a majority with the same message?
We've had 2 years of this government. We've had now 3 Tory Prime Ministers since I became leader of the Labour Party. We're very well prepared for this election campaign and going to go out there and do it.
Jeremy Corbyn, the campaigner, is back. But it's not about the energy of the home crowd. It's whether his party can translate this into a convincing campaign in every corner of the country.
I've already been out campaigning and it's really positive on the doorstep. If we're going to have a chance, it's got to be now. We've got to go for it, 100% full commitment.
More important than necessarily even this win is the fact that we've got such a huge mobilisation of people.
Did staff make that? Yes. I don't believe it.
Just in case you were wondering what Boris Johnson wants to talk about, he spent the Halloween he hadn't hoped for in class in Suffolk. Then trumpeting the government's plans for building new hospitals in Cambridge.
That's it, I definitely squirted some in there.
Having to explain why he's asking us to go to the polls at all.
This Parliament is just not going to vote Brexit through. And so the only thing we can really do now is go to our people, go to the country and say, come on, let's get this thing done. We've got an oven-ready deal, put it in the microwave.
The Lib Dems tried to take their Stop Brexit message round Parliament Square. Protesters were more concerned about stopping them.
We want a bright future for this country. And in order to do that, we have to stop Brexit. And with the remaining bonus we get, invest in our public services and have an economy that is growing.
This is an election where you can't say they're all the same. The result could mark a dramatic junction for the country.
The Westminster system is broken. Yes. And that's why the people of Scotland need the choice of independence.
Halloween's obviously very big here.
The parties are all somewhat spooked, with good reason. The doorstep might look familiar, but this is an uncertain time, an uncertain campaign, and a very uncertain result. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Westminster.
So Jeremy Corbyn says Labour will put forward what he called a radical and exciting plan for real change. Our Deputy Political Editor John Pienaar looks at what Labour's key campaign pledges could mean for you.
What does it mean for me at work?
Jeremy Corbyn's offered real change, and his plans for rights and rewards for people at work certainly offer that. Take pay. Under Labour, over time, they'd be negotiated centrally, sector by sector, nationwide. That's a much bigger role for trade unions, which would be recognised by law. But some say some companies can't afford to pay as much as others. You'd risk pricing people out of work. On staff ownership, more people would own a stake in their company under Labour. 10% of shares in companies with more than 250 staff. Would that deter investment, maybe put bosses off growing their workforce? Or, if you owned a stake in your company, would you work harder, maybe push up profits? Other big changes, a 32-hour working week over 10 years. Sceptics say cut working hours and people end up being paid less.
Are Labour going to renationalise everything?
A Corbyn government would renationalise, that means the state owns it, on a huge scale. Mail, rail, water, energy. There hasn't been a Labour plan so far-reaching and radical in nearly 40 years. Critics, like the CBI, say the cost would be eye-watering, nearly £200 billion. Labour says that's over the top, fanciful, and anyway, the profits could go towards paying off interest on the money borrowed to buy the assets.
What about schools and hospitals?
We're still waiting for detailed costings, but more cash for schools and hospitals is on offer. The party's in something of a bidding war with Boris Johnson, who's making rival promises to end austerity and invest in our services.
What do Labour mean by for the many, not the few?
Jeremy Corbyn wants to build what he calls a fairer country, with higher taxes on corporations, the rich and the better off. Labour would target those he calls dodgy landlords, greedy bosses and polluters. It's a long list. He's promising stronger rights for tenants and for workers. The big argument's about whether higher taxes punish success. Labour says it's about fairness, more from those who can afford it. And anyway, most people won't have to pay any more. In this election, so much could come down to the question, who do voters trust? Boris Johnson's personal ratings in the polls are low compared to past leaders. But just now, Jeremy Corbyn's are far worse. Worse than any Labour leader in decades. Now that can change. Whether it does could have a big influence on the outcome of what will be the most unpredictable general election we've seen.
There.
Well, far from the forgotten conventions of staying out of other countries' politics, President Trump stormed into the UK's 2019 election campaign today, declaring Jeremy Corbyn would be so bad for the country and urging Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson to get together as an unstoppable force. He also criticised Mr. Johnson's Brexit deal, though, suggesting the US couldn't make a trade agreement with the UK. All this on the very day Britain was supposed to be coming out of the EU. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is with me.
Well, the day starts fairly conventionally for an election. You see the two party leaders going out on the stump, trying to put out their core messages. Jeremy Corbyn saying this manifesto this time is going to be even more radical than his last one. Boris Johnson saying Parliament had stymied him and was holding back all the nice things he really wanted to do if only he could get Brexit done. And then you have the American president doing almost from a copybook what a foreign leader is not meant to do, and wading in, jumping into the British general election, rubbishing Jeremy Corbyn, praising Boris Johnson, but really interestingly suggesting to Nigel Farage, who's sitting at the other end hosting his phone-in with this man dialing in from Washington, telling him that he should be doing a deal with Boris Johnson. Now, the Brexit Party is the dog that hasn't barked in this election so far. Will they throw themselves completely into this election campaign, fight every single seat as Nigel Farage originally promised, or do something a lot less than that? We're promised an announcement tomorrow on that, but this is how the day that Brexit was meant to happen actually went.
October the 31st.
Today, the date with destiny. He promised, others echoed.
I remember it. Mark, he said, look, we've got to leave on the 31st of October, otherwise everyone in this room is out of a job, including you and including me.
We will come out of the EU on October the 31st.
Basically, we are mummifying a pumpkin.
Instead of celebrating Brexit, Boris Johnson was watching a Halloween crafts session in Suffolk and blaming Labour for his broken promise.
You said we'd leave the EU tonight. We won't. So why should anyone trust anything else you say during this campaign?
Well, of course, I'm incredibly frustrated that we're not able to get Brexit done today. But let's be in no doubt what's happened. We had a fantastic deal on the table. The House of Commons voted it through, but then they voted again for delay. Stick it in the water.
This at another campaign stop at Cambridgeshire Hospital. Questions about Brexit. His photo ops proclaiming the issues he wants voters to think a government can move on to once Brexit is done.
Give it a squeeze.
Jeremy Corbyn paraded his shadow cabinet team in South London. He said Boris Johnson's plans for a US-UK trade deal after Brexit would harm the NHS.
We will stop them. Labour won't let Donald Trump get his hands on our National Health Service. It's not for sale.
Jeremy Corbyn joined in a chant, which you'll probably hear again. And he rolled out another central message of the campaign. He would fight for the people against the establishment.
The Prime Minister wants you to believe that we're having this election because Brexit is being blocked by an establishment elite. He's a man of much imagination. People aren't fooled so easily. They know the Conservatives are the establishment elite.
Well, he's privately educated as well, as far as I know. This is not about where you come from or what your background is. This is about your vision for the country.
The Lib Dems paraded their campaign slogan on a van that then toured the constituencies of Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn before coming back to a small but hostile crowd of Leave demonstrators. The Lib Dems' opponents are promising the first stage of Brexit could be settled one way or another within months or weeks, depending who you vote for.
We've got an oven-ready deal. Put it in the microwave as soon as we get back after the election on Friday, on the 12th of December. Get it done, and then let's get on with our domestic agenda.
Labour will get Brexit sorted within 6 months. We'll let the people decide whether to leave on a sensible deal or remain. It really isn't that complicated.
Tonight, an extraordinary intervention by President Trump in the general election. Donald Trump dialed into Nigel Farage's phone-in programme and broke all convention, wading into the contest here.
Boris, he's a fantastic man, and I think he's the exact right guy for the times. And I know that you and him will end up doing something that could be terrific. If you and he get together, it's unstoppable force. And Corbyn would be so bad for your country. He'd be so bad. He'd take you in such a bad way. He'd take you into such bad places.
Pressure on Nigel Farage as he weighs up whether to stand his Brexit Party candidates in every seat in the country, as he promised only a few weeks ago. An announcement is due tomorrow. We asked two veterans of the Commons what they make of it so far. Ken Clarke, an independent Conservative with the whip removed, retiring after 49 years in the Commons, and former Tory leader and Brexit supporter Ian Duncan Smith. If you were a young man now, would you join the Conservative Party?
Not at this moment, no. I have to say candidly, I don't think I would.
Who will you be voting for in the general election?
I've voted Conservative every election in my life.
Wasn't quite my...
No, well, I think I once previously sort of rather recklessly in public said, am I going to be tempted to cast an Orpington-type protest vote, which, fortunately, only people my age know what I'm talking about. Getting back to the
Lib Dem by-election triumph. Have we got a clue there?
The first by-election triumph of modern politics.
In the privacy of the polling station, it might be Lib Dem.
I think 40-odd% of the public have not voted for the same party in the 3 elections. It depends what sort of campaign the party run. If we really do make ourselves the Brexit party under our brand, my loyalty is going to be strained absolutely to the utmost. I'm not voting for some crazy right-wing nationalist organisation calling itself a Conservative government.
Here's Ken Clark sitting next to you saying he struggles with the idea of saying he will vote Conservative and he wouldn't join it as a young man. Doesn't that worry you?
Well, I think it just says how dominant this issue of Brexit has become in everybody's minds, and as far as it dominates Ken's mind. The point I make, though, is it is an issue we have to settle because we have to get to the other issues, which for everybody's lives are probably far, far more important.
They didn't get the Brexit they were promised for Halloween, but where their support goes now is one story in the 6-week contest now beginning.
Having failed in his promise to leave the EU tonight, Boris Johnson promised today to get the UK out of the EU by January next year. If he's to do that, his party will need to win a majority and convert Labour constituencies to Conservative ones. But is Brexit the only thing on voters' minds in those target seats? Our Home Affairs correspondent Andy Davis is in the key Labour marginal of Newcastle-under-Lyme in Staffordshire.
Well, on the streets below, there are children out and about, trick-or-treating, knocking on doors. But of course, in the weeks to come, it's going to be political activists pounding the streets, hoping for gifts in the form of votes. We're above Silverdale, an old mining town just west of Newcastle-under-Lyme. Think of it as old established Labour. There's been a Labour MP here, uninterrupted, for the last 100 years. It is exactly the sort of place which Jeremy Corbyn will need to hold, and exactly the sort of place which Boris Johnson will be eyeing up, particularly given the strong pro-Brexit vote at the EU referendum. Newcastle-under-Lyme, market town and marginal, a constituency where around 62% voted Leave, which Labour held by just 30 votes in the last general election. No wonder it's high up on the Tory target list. What will be your key message on the doorstep?
Vote Conservative, vote Boris, because we'll actually get you out of the EU.
Even though you haven't, and you promised to do it by today?
Yes, but it's only because we've been stopped.
A claim opponents would dispute, and one no doubt which will help fuel the argument set to engulf key electoral battlegrounds like this. So on Halloween, the day Boris Johnson pledged to deliver Brexit, have voters here already made up their minds?
We're still undecided, really undecided. I don't trust any of them.
But what's going to influence you in how you vote?
Just dealing with Brexit. What else can there be at the minute? That's the only thing.
And who do you think will deal with Brexit best?
Probably Boris, and I wouldn't normally say that. I wouldn't normally stick up for Tories, if I'm being honest.
You haven't decided yet who
No.
you'll vote for?
Not decided now.
Why not?
Because I feel like in politics, you're not voting for the best, you're voting for the one who's going to mess up the least.
Many here mentioned Brexit as a priority, but on the day party leaders talked up their credentials on public services, we found plenty of voters with broader agendas to appeal to, such as these students at nearby Keele University. For you all, what would be the biggest single issue which will determine how you vote?
For me, it's disability support. My brother's severely mentally disabled. My brother's needs are always going to come first, and I know certain parties are more likely to support him than others.
What would swing my vote is actually seeing some of the wider social, environmental issues actually being discussed. For me, it's not just about Brexit, it's about if Brexit happens or not, what's going to happen after Brexit as well.
For me, it's also the environment and just general sort of fairness, insight in the economy.
And is there a particular party that appeals to you on those sorts of issues?
I think the Lib Dems have the right message on all three of them, so that's who I'll be voting for.
The student vote could prove pivotal in a constituency as marginal as this. A seat occupied by Labour MPs continuously for a century. Tom Wilson, a gas engineer and local Labour activist, wants to keep it that way. Isn't the challenge for you in Labour in a constituency like this to get to get the conversation away from Brexit?
I think people are more worried about having a roof over their head, having food in the belly, and having a little bit of some money to spend on something to do at the weekend to keep life interesting. I think people are more bothered about that than Brexit when you boil it down.
A handful of votes made the difference in Newcastle under Lyme last time. In the run-up to Christmas, the contest, fiercely fought no doubt once more, begins again.
Well, now, campaigning for the election doesn't officially start until next week when Parliament is dissolved. Nevertheless, the Prime Minister and the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn were both out and about today. But perhaps the most significant intervention came from the other side of the Atlantic, with President Trump breaking all the rules on interfering in another country's election. He said Mr Johnson is exactly the right guy for the times and should get together with Nigel Farage and his Brexit party.
A pact between Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage. Could that swing it for the Tories in this election? Well, Donald Trump thinks so, weighing in tonight with some extraordinary and unprecedented advice.
Boris, he's a fantastic man, and I think he's the exact right guy for the times. And I know that you and him will end up doing something that could be terrific. If you and he get together, it's, you know, unstoppable force. And Corbyn would be so bad for your country. He'd be so bad, he'd take you in such a bad way.
Interference to get his friend elected, Mr Corbyn fired back tonight, earlier having claimed that a cosy relationship between Donald Trump and Boris Johnson would put the NHS at risk in any future trade deal.
Labour won't let Donald Trump get his hands on our National Health Service. It's not for sale.
His supporters loved that, and his message that Labour was on the side of the people, not the powerful.
When Labour wins, the nurse wins, the pensioner wins, the student wins, the office worker wins, the engineer wins, we all win!
But what about his policy on Brexit? Arguably the issue of our time.
In this election, Labour is no longer promising to implement the result of the 2016 referendum. Instead, it wants to see another referendum next year. But Jeremy Corbyn still won't say whether he would back Leave or Remain.
You say that now you're the party that wants to give the people a final say. In that referendum, which way will you vote?
Our party will come together in the way we always do, discuss that and decide what we're going to do.
Despite the kisses, not everyone in the shadow cabinet is so enamoured of that approach. For the Prime Minister visiting a genetics lab in Cambridge today, the sequencing certainly different. He believes having got the ingredients of a new deal...
And give it a squeeze.
Absolutely, push down hard.
Yep, that's it. I definitely squirted some in there.
Promising to deliver it swiftly is his best hope.
If you vote for us and we get our programme through, which we will, because as I say, it's oven ready, it's there to go, then we can be out at the absolute latest by January next year.
But having missed his Halloween deadline, it was just a day for pumpkins at this school. Could setting another one come back to haunt him? The Liberal Democrats certainly hope so, promising to stop Brexit altogether. Not much Christmas cheer in their message either. Instead, a stark warning about what the two main parties have to offer the voters this winter. Libby Vina, News at 10, Westminster.
And Paul is here to talk about all this. Now, listen, last night you put out a tweet, actually, about running into a woman MP in floods of tears. You know, this is absolutely disgraceful and out of hand, isn't it?
Yeah, and look, Tom, a couple of years ago we talked about social media as a great democratising force, you know, making MPs more accountable, more responsive. I think it has done that, but it's also made them more vulnerable. And I think we've probably reached a tipping point now where there is a risk that rather than making MPs more reachable, perhaps they're going to have to start withdrawing from public spaces because of the threat to their safety, to their well-being. And I think in this election, perhaps we're beginning to gather the first testimony, the first empirical evidence, if you like, that these threats and abuse are having a chilling effect on our democracy. They are encouraging a small but significant number of MPs to withdraw from politics. They're encouraging other MPs to do politics differently, more cautiously. The MP you mentioned that I bumped into last night, for example, who'd had 2,000 pieces of abuse just this week, and we are only last night on Wednesday.
Yeah.
She won't go on TV because she is actively trying to lower her profile to reduce the risk. And so, look, if we want our MPs to be more human, then I think we have to recognise that this abuse dehumanises them. It probably doesn't encourage good people into politics.
Yeah, well, let's move on to talk about politics. We probably should. Intervention by the US president, very keen for the Tory party and the Brexit party to get together in some way. Is that going to happen?
Well, we might find out tomorrow when Nigel Farage launches the Brexit Party's election campaign. He was kind of denying today this idea that maybe the Brexit Party will only stand in 20 or 30 northern seats. Boris Johnson publicly has ruled out a pact with the Brexit Party. I almost thought what was more extraordinary today, though, was the leader of the opposition believing that the disapproval of the President of the United States of America is a badge of honour. I mean, that is extraordinary when you think about it, Tom, where we are right now with politics. But clearly Jeremy Corbyn wants to portray Boris Johnson as too cosy with President Trump, this idea that the NHS is on the table in a trade deal. Downing Street denies that. But Jeremy Corbyn thinks this plays well with his base. And so for now, he feels that being called so bad by President Trump is so good for his image.
OK. Paul, thank you very much indeed. So, as we saw earlier in the programme, Jeremy Corbyn was in full-on campaign mode today. But is his brand of Labour politics likely to win over enough Conservative voters in Northern England to give him a chance of becoming the next Prime Minister? After all, we haven't had a new one in months. Well, Calder Valley in West Yorkshire is a good place to start looking when it comes to key battleground constituencies. There, only 300 voters have to switch sides for it to go from Conservative to Labour.
As the leaves fall and colours change in Yorkshire's Hebden Bridge, the political colours may also be about to turn. Right now it's Tory, but it could easily go red.
Jeremy Corbyn is launching Labour's election campaign today in Battersea, but it is an oddly cautious choice of venue. Nobody doubts his Londoner credentials. But what about here, 250 miles north in Yorkshire?
But local activists are doing him proud in this ultra-marginal of Calder Valley. Last time the Tories won only by the skin of their teeth.
This T-shirt was the number of votes that we lost by in the last election.
I'm going to be voting Labour because I think they're offering some hope to the country. I think actually this is as critical almost as the 1945 election.
Are you going to vote Labour?
Yeah, I'm going to vote Labour. Jeremy Corbyn seems very charismatic. You feel very connected to him, you know.
Jeremy Corbyn has his fans in Hebden Bridge, but the constituency is the whole Calder Valley, and post-industrial problems lie alongside rural ones. Can Labour really convince?
Ben, we're looking out over Calder Valley. You guys lost it in 2010. Why?
And Labour, frankly, failed to offer an alternative vision, failed to offer a bold transformative vision. It was just managed decline. I think the policies we have now that are even more bold, even more transformative, with things like the Green New Deal, bringing hundreds of thousands of green jobs, protecting the beautiful countryside that we can see around us. I think we can get over the line and start to win places like this back.
That's the Corbynista view, but the view is not as picture perfect for others in the Labour family.
I think it's very hard for Labour to win in seats like Calder Valley at the moment. There's very strong working class communities. The Labour Party is very much about, you know, people living in North London, quite middle class, and its appeal to those sorts of communities, I think, has been lost in recent years.
These are 15 of our alpacas. They're all females, and these are animals that we shear.
Their annual fleece drives Farmer Sean's local bedding business.
Would you like a Jeremy Corbyn government?
No, quite frankly. Especially when he's talking about taking away money in form of taxes from the elite or from the rich. And it's what he perceives as the elite and the rich. Is that me with my small business, or is it people that run huge corporations?
Colin, the reason we've come here is that there's some doubt that they can even get the easy seats.
Labour have got to get out. They've got to go to the north of England.
We're calling Colin Rallings, our election analyst.
They've got to win more than 60 seats to get a bare overall majority in Parliament. And for that, they need to swing in excess of 5% since the last election. And they did pretty well at the last election. They got 40% of the vote. Every piece of evidence suggests they've fallen back since then. To win seats, to gain even quite easy seats like Calder Valley, they need to have fallen back by less than the Conservatives.
Just as the Valley sides loom large here, the two main parties stand tall, making what should be easy for Labour harder to call. Allegra Stratton, News at 10, Calder Valley.
Well, before he had Donald Trump assessing his chances, Jeremy Corbyn launched Labour's campaign in Battersea today and insisted the election was not about him as he addressed the fact that he has the lowest personal poll ratings of any leader of the opposition in more than 30 years. He promised Labour would launch the biggest people-powered campaign in history for real change for the many, not for the few, marshalling his supporters for what he believes will be a dirty fight. And Brexit, well, he said that it was not that complicated and he could get it done in 6 months. Here's Nick again.
He's back. And hoping for Act 2. Written off as tired, Jeremy Corbyn is now thriving in his natural environment.
We are going after the tax dodgers.
Labour wants to focus on its traditional themes, in particular the NHS, and a claim that Boris Johnson's Brexit deal could open up the health service.
Labour won't let Donald Trump get his hands on our National Health Service. It's not for sale.
And then a striking slogan for another time-honoured Labour theme.
And the big question in this election is, whose side are you on? Are you on the side? Are you on the side of the tax dodgers who are taking us all for a ride? Or are you on the side of the children with special education needs who aren't getting the support they deserve because of Tory and Lib Dem government cuts? We have challenged this government.
Short shrift for claims that Labour will fight shy on Brexit, with a pledge to deliver a comprehensive deal encompassing both Britain's departure and the future relationship.
Labour will get Brexit sorted within 6 months. We'll let the people decide whether to leave on a sensible deal or remain. It really isn't that complicated.
Now he's behind a Conservative Prime Minister. The Conservatives saying you're trying to block Brexit. Is he doomed from the start, or is there a precedent for him coming back?
There is a precedent for him coming back. It's what we saw in 2017. It's 20 points behind, and we drew almost level pegging. So I'm confident, Labour members are confident, that at the end of the 6 weeks, Jeremy will be walking into number 10.
John McDonnell, there's been a feeling that your good friend Jeremy Corbyn is a bit fed up. Maybe he wants to retire. What's the status update after that performance?
Well, you've seen that, haven't you? He's out there already. He's been on the doorsteps and all the rest. He's been rally after rally. He's up for this. He's really up for this. More importantly, he's up for going into government. We've been preparing for this for a number of years. We win an election, get into government, hit the deck running. We've got the policies ready. We've got our first budget ready. We've got legislation ready to go. We just want to get into government now. And you saw that enthusiasm from Jeremy today.
From a supportive veteran of the New Labour era, a note of caution.
Well, you can get cheered in a hall and it's good. It makes you feel good. I've been there. I've experienced it. But actually, if you're not touching people in their living rooms, if they're not feeling that you are one of them, if you're actually not addressing their immediate concerns, or if you frighten them, and many people who would very much like the rich to pay more actually also have sons and daughters who will be aspirational, then you lose out.
In going to Battersea, Jeremy Corbyn was signalling that he wants to recreate the mood of his finest hour, when Labour gained one of London's marginal seats in the 2017 general election. Today he was focusing on his signature themes, but he also had a message for Boris Johnson. I will happily move to your chosen theme of Brexit, because Labour would offer voters a choice of a new and lasting settlement, rather than stumbling at the first step of leaving.
6 weeks to go and a rejuvenated Jeremy Corbyn returns to the fray with the ambition of upsetting Boris Johnson's great election gamble.
That was Nick Watt, of course. Well, Clive Lewis is the Shadow Treasury Minister for Sustainable Economics. He joins us from Norwich. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, Clive. We'll come on to Donald Trump's comments in a moment. But first, let's just talk about the launch this morning. Very clearly, the line from Jeremy Corbyn, whose side are you on? This election is about healing divides, supposedly, but rather than taking the moral high ground and saying it's time to grow together, Jeremy Corbyn made it about them and us and them, creating and continuing that divide that he said is so damaging in the country.
I think what's damaging the country, when you talk about them and us, we're talking about the vast majority of people in this country, 99% of people in this country. We're living through a new gilded age, like at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, where you have grotesque levels of inequality, where a handful of people are some of the most powerful, wealthiest people in the world, people like Donald Trump and his friends. And what we're saying is, after 40 years of a failed economic philosophy, with 10 years of austerity, we want to see something different, where working people in this country, everyday people in this country, begin to get their fair share of wealth and power. I think that's quite clear. It's not about turning people against each other, but it's saying that our society is unequal, our economy is unequal, and it's about turning that around.
So what he did this morning, Jeremy Corbyn, was point out, as he would say, 4 big offenders on the kind of dodgy bankers, all that kind of thing. But can you point to people in the upper tax bracket who are actually doing good work, for example?
Well, yes, and there are people that are doing good work in the upper tax bracket, and we've been quite clear. In our last manifesto, we said that only the top 5% of earners will be receiving higher tax. But let's be really clear here, it's not just about income tax that we're talking about. We're also talking about wealth. Those forces within society, within the economy now, increasing our share of GDP, which are rent-seeking, those who take money without actually putting anything back into the economy. That's also a big part of what we're looking at redistributing and reforming.
Just to clarify that point, you know, when he attacks Mike Ashley, he doesn't then say, well, let's look at this good example. Very clearly, very happy to name what he would call the offenders, but not give credit where credit might be due. And I wonder if the actual sentiment is like the sentiment delivered by the MP Lloyd Russell Moyles today, is it says that billionaires should not exist in Britain.
Well, I think there's something to be said for that. I think it's something that Bernie Sanders said as well. Billionaires shouldn't exist. It's a travesty that there are people on this planet living on less than $1 a day. There are people, when I walk into Parliament, who are rough sleeping on the streets of this country, the 6th wealthiest in the world, and yet we have a larger number of billionaires in this country than ever before. That is wrong. Hey, let people make money, let people run a business, but we need to make sure that the grotesque levels of inequality in this country are reduced. It's run away, it's out of control, and I think most of the British public understand that.
So if Jeremy Corbyn was to win the magic, or whatever it is, nearly 80 seats, and become the Prime Minister of this country, how do you think his relationship would be with Donald Trump after Donald Trump essentially saying that he would be bad for the country and he would do bad things to this country? How would that relationship work?
Well, let's see if Donald Trump's still there, because this is a president who is facing impeachment for the abuse of power, the obstruction of justice, contempt of Congress. I'm not sure Jeremy Corbyn may have to deal with Donald Trump, because actually Donald Trump has his own problems. And I think listening to Donald Trump come on to Nigel Farage's programme and big up Boris Johnson, you can begin to see the kind of axis, I'm not going to say of evil, but the axis of power that these people are circulating in. It's about corporate power, corporate wealth, bullies like Donald Trump, people who are quite despicable. And I think the vast majority of people in this country have no love for Donald Trump and all that he wants to do to our NHS in terms of a trade deal that he wants to fix up with Boris Johnson. I actually don't think Jeremy Corbyn is going to have too much to worry about in terms of Donald Trump.
Well, let's see if he didn't get a stonking majority and he had to supposedly make deals. You've been somebody who's been very keen on the idea of progressive alliance, but it was made very clear by Jeremy Corbyn today is there would be no coalition. There would be a minority government if that had to be the case, which suggests that in order for a minority government to play out, you'd have to have confidence and supply, presumably with the SNP. That would presumably be the only deal that you could make for confidence and supply.
Look, we're going in this election to win, not to draw, not to go into minority administration, not to do a confidence and supply. We're going in to win. This is probably one of the most important general elections in the post-war period, probably the most important. It will determine which way our country goes towards bargain basement, NHS up for sale, a trade deal with the US, or does it stay within the parameters of Europe and our friends over there? This is a massive geopolitical issue for this country, not just in terms of Europe, but in terms of the direction that our economy goes. And I think Jeremy Corbyn set that out very clearly today. That's what we're going into this election to win, and nothing else.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Clive Lewis. Well, Scotland will play a key role in Boris Johnson's bid to get back into Downing Street. And one of the biggest battlegrounds, literally, will be Stirling, the town where William Wallace routed the English forces of Edward I in 1297, and a three-way marginal. In the 2017 election, the SNP was defeated there by the Tories, one of the 13 seats they won under the charismatic leadership of Ruth Davidson. But with Ruth Davidson gone, will the Tories' fortunes turn again? In a minute, I will speak to David Mundell, who was the lone Tory MP for 12 years from 2005. But first, here's James Clayton.
Halloween in Stirling. Time to pound the streets, knock on doors and annoy the local residents. And that's just the politicians. The SNP spectacularly lost this seat to Ruth Davidson's Tories in 2017, but she's now quit as party leader, something not lost on SNP candidate Alan Smith. Do you think that Ruth Davidson not being leader of the party, though, helps you?
Yes.
For sure?
No question. No question. We've got an articulate, bright woman leading us who's popular, and they don't. And that was an advantage for them in 2017, no question. It's now not the case.
Around here is an SNP stronghold, but there are hints of divisions. Would they ever, should they ever, prop up Labour? Would you mind a Labour SNP pact or some kind of electoral pact? Would you mind that?
Wouldn't I mean the pact, the Labour, no.
Any kind of pact with Labour, would you be supportive of that?
No.
No?
No, the way it is just now, anyway.
Both the SNP and Labour know this matters. They've both ruled out a formal coalition. But for Corbyn to get into power and the SNP to get a second referendum, they may well need each other.
It's a wider question in terms of what would you do in this scenario, what would you do in this scenario, which so far we've been able to dismiss as, well, that's a hypothetical, let's see. But obviously we've got more common ground with the Labour Party than the Tories.
This seat was a traditional bellwether constituency. Tory till 97, Labour till 2015. Now it's the Conservatives who are running scared. It's received wisdom in Westminster that the Scottish Tories are in trouble. If you look at the polls, the SNP haven't actually gained that much support in the last 2 years. The reason for the speculation is because, and once again you have to believe the polls here, the Scottish Tories have hemorrhaged about a quarter of their 2017 vote share. In the summer, Newsnight came to Stirling's Conservative Association to cover the Tory leadership contest and picked up, let's say, mixed feelings for Boris Johnson. Last time we were here, we spoke to a Conservative activist and we asked her, how would you view a Boris Johnson premiership? She said, with horror. Now he's your leader.
Yeah.
Is that a problem trying to galvanise the party?
I don't think it is, actually. The party, one thing that unites Conservative activists generally is our belief in democracy. So when the party makes a decision for Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, then he's the leader of our party. He's going to take us into the election. The thing about Boris Johnson is that you see when you go out and you speak to people about it, people have heard of him. People know who he is. And
they like him?
Yeah, you know what? There is actually a strand of opinion that likes him.
Yesterday, Jeremy Corbyn said that he didn't want a second referendum, but wouldn't stand in the way of one in the future. Labour don't yet have a candidate in Stirling, despite this being a three-way marginal, so I caught up with their group leader. 5 years ago, there was a Labour MP here. Now you don't even have a Labour candidate. What's happened to the Labour Party?
At present, that's being decided by the Scottish Executive Committee, so we'll know who the candidate is in the coming days. And you're absolutely right, we had a Labour MP here not that long ago at all. So we've had that for 18 years serving Stirling, and we're absolutely determined to return a Labour MP at this election.
Jeremy Corbyn has left the door open to a second referendum. Is that going to help you on the doorstep?
The leader of the Scottish Labour Party, Richard Leonard, has been very clear. There is no case for a second referendum. But
your national leader hasn't been.
But in any democracy, there's nothing that can get ruled out forever. If the Scottish National Party want in a Scottish election to go to the people of Scotland and get a majority, as they did, even David Cameron agreed to a referendum on independence.
There's plenty more pavement bashing ahead for all the parties here, and predicting politics right now is a mug's game. But if the polls are to be believed, the Tories are going to be in for a fright here.
James Clayton. So David Mundell joins us now from his constituency in Moffat. David Mundell, good evening. Thanks very much for joining us. You're going into this election minus your biggest asset.
I don't accept that. I mean, Ruth Davidson was a transformational leader of the Scottish Conservatives, and I'm sorry that she's stepped down, but the message that Ruth took forward is the same message that we're taking into this election. The Scottish Conservatives are the only party in Scotland who will stand up to the SNP, the only party who will say no to having another independence referendum. And that is vitally important to people across Scotland who in the 2014 independence referendum voted to stay in the United Kingdom.
Hang on. I mean, Ruth Davidson is no longer your leader, but as far as I understand it, her face is still on election leaflets.
And that's because she's still an active member and supporter of the Conservative Party. The leader of the Labour Party at the last election isn't even in the Labour Party anymore. Ruth wants to play a part as we go forward, but she felt that she couldn't balance her responsibilities as a mother with being the full-time leader of the Conservative Party. But she's still going to play a role, and that's perfectly proper.
Do you think that Boris Johnson will be an electoral asset to you, given that you're, whatever it is, 9 percentage points down than you were in 2017, and by that token you would lose a considerable amount of seats? Do you want him on the doorstep with you, for example?
Well, I'm quite happy for Boris Johnson to come to Scotland, and he will be very shortly. What people in Scotland will judge Boris Johnson on is what he actually does as Prime Minister. And so far, on the two most important issues, Brexit, where he has secured a deal to allow us to leave the EU with a deal, which is what I think most people in Scotland now want to see, and on the Union, standing up for Scotland's place in the United Kingdom, not proceeding with another independence referendum, as Jeremy Corbyn has made quite clear now that he would do. So I think when people come to judge Boris Johnson, they'll judge him on those facts, and they'll compare him to the other person who could be the Prime Minister of our country, who would do a deal with Nicola Sturgeon and allow another independence referendum.
So do you think Donald Trump's intervention, positing a hard Brexit and the possibility that he wouldn't buy Boris Johnson's Brexit deal, is that good in Scotland? Would people be happy to see an even harder deal, or perhaps a kind of Farage-Johnson effort at a deal? Would that go down well in a country where every single area voted Remain in the referendum?
I think people in Scotland take Donald Trump's interventions in any matter with a pinch of salt. Mr. Trump is the sort of character who, as we know, makes colourful comments. He's said many different things about a possible trade deal. What Boris Johnson's deal does is it allows us to leave the EU in an orderly fashion. It allows us to have a free trade arrangement with the EU, but to make our own arrangements with other countries. Now, those are going to be complex negotiations, but ultimately those arrangements will also have to be approved by Parliament. So there will be plenty of opportunity for specific discussion on specific trade deals.
But would it be worth leaving the customs union, creating a border in the Irish Sea, if you're still going to be perhaps at the back of the queue, as was so famously said before by somebody else, in a US trade deal? You're not going to get the US trade deal you want, according to Donald Trump. Now, you can say that, he's not necessarily a figure of fun, but something you take as a pinch of salt. He may still will be the American president.
Well, I don't think that, it's as straightforward matter making trade deals. They're complex negotiations, and when we make a trade deal with the US, we want there to be advantages in that deal for us. It's not a one-way street where that trade deal is solely determined by President Trump, and ultimately it's a deal that will have to be debated and discussed in Parliament. And you know, that's the next stage of this process. The important thing now is that we sort Brexit, we leave the EU, and that we can then begin the process of entering into discussions around those sort of trade deals.
David Mandel, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And I am joined by Katie Balls from The Spectator, former Labour pollster James Morris, and Colvia Ranger, who formerly worked under Boris Johnson in the Mayor's office, to talk through all the front pages. But before we take a look at what's going on, it's just a minute to 11 o'clock. That is the 31st of October, that die-in-the-ditch deadline for leaving the EU. Guess what? The Brexit countdown clock is resetting. In just under a minute, we will again be 92 days until the next deadline at the end of January, as it says so clearly behind us in the Newsnight studio. So now we're almost there. We're almost starting the next deadline in 3, 2, 1. We're there. So it's time to take a look at tomorrow morning's front pages. And we now begin 90. Yes, look, we are there. 92 days behind us and still to go. Let's just remember it's a long, long way. And the Financial Times, Trump impeachment hearings to be held in open after the key vote. And Mike Ashley, having been trashed by Jeremy Corbyn, Ashley hits back at clueless Corbyn as business warns on Labour leader's tone. And moving on to the Daily Mail, Trump tells Farage, do a deal with Boris. And then on to the Times, Trump tells Johnson to join forces with Farage. The Daily Telegraph, same story again. Trump urges Farage to do a deal with Johnson. President attacks Corbyn, encourages Brexiteers to make a general election pact. Katie Balls, first of all. Here we have it. Brexit party launch tomorrow. Trump saying there has to be a deal between Farage and Boris Johnson, presumably in order to get another kind of Brexit deal. Chances are.
I still think the chances are low that the Tories are going to cooperate on any deal. We know previously Nigel Farage has been keen to push for one. We have the launch tomorrow of the Brexit Party, where we hear what they're setting out. But ultimately, I think the issue is, what type of electoral pact would be beneficial to the Tories that involves standing aside for Brexit Party candidates? Because you look at these Labour heartlands, heavy Leave areas, that Nigel Farage thinks his party will do well in. Well, guess what? The Tories think they would do well there. So I don't think they will want to stand aside.
Do you think there is anything in the Trump intervention that is truly difficult for Boris Johnson? We've just heard David Mandel there sort of saying, you know, the idea that there wouldn't be a trade deal is kind of, you know, it's simply Donald Trump going off on one.
Well, it feels like, again, American president is unhappy with Brexit, because it was Barack Obama who said that Britain and the UK would be at the back of the queue for a trade deal, and Donald Trump feels that this trade deal isn't very good, which actually Boris Johnson is going to be campaigning on his trade deal. Well, sorry, his deal, his withdrawal agreement that he's got agreed with the EU. Donald Trump is not happy with what Boris Johnson has. So I think, actually, this isn't about the American president being happy with where Boris Johnson is. It's trying to get him to move to a different position. That's not where Boris Johnson wants to be. So alignment with Boris Johnson and Donald Trump is not there.
But then we have, James, the prospect that actually Donald Trump is coming here for a NATO summit a week before the election, and presumably, because we know he likes to talk, will certainly talk about something.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that Donald Trump dialed into a local radio station in the UK is a coup for that radio station.
I think it was set up.
But
I think he just dialed in.
Ultimately, it is not going to make a massive difference to the election campaign, particularly because what he was talking about was his view about the appropriate trade relationship between the UK and the US going forwards. That is not where voters are about the deal. That may be where business is, it may be what wonks are thinking about, but voters are like, can we get this thing done? Or can we stop it? And anything that's in that detail is just not going to make much difference.
But then you have Jeremy Corbyn launching a campaign and saying very simply, you might say, well, it's not that complicated. We can get a Brexit deal done in 6 months. Do you think the voters believe that?
They really want to get through this. So
Corbyn's got motherhood and apple pie.
But Corbyn's problem on Brexit is that he is facing neither one way nor the other. So today he says it's simple, but he also says we can have a referendum to decide whether we'll do it or not. So his problem is that he might have sounded simple today, but he will get unpicked by the complexity of that position that points in two different directions. But what all the parties have recognised is that you need real simplicity on Brexit to mean something to people.
So, and also get a situation, Covey, where Jeremy Corbyn is now unashamedly, it sounds like, and what we also heard from Clive Lewis there, almost in an old-fashioned class war.
It is. It does sound very strange, because especially when you see a slogan today that was talking about real change. But it didn't feel like real change. It felt like Jeremy Corbyn...
But this is no home for billionaires now.
No, and it did feel like a them and us, a division approach to the electorate, and really trying to sort of talk about class warfare, social warfare, economic warfare, and where people sit, which... In a country that we feel has been divided by Brexit, we're trying to divide further. Not sure if that's going to help Jeremy Corbyn move.
But they must have focus grouped all this before they started.
I mean, I think there's a view within Labour, Corbyn allies, that they need to be more radical. And ultimately, they felt that they had lots of clear blue water in 2017 against the Tories. They think the Tories have moved to them on economic issues, funding.
I mean, you can't hit them so hard now in the NHS. You can't hit them so hard now.
Exactly, because they've moved more to higher spend, and therefore they think they need to find other ways to be radical. And I think that's why you are going to get that big pitch. And you also got that pitch at Labour conference. But the attack line we keep hearing from Jeremy Corbyn goes back to this US trade deal, and it's about the NHS and their claim that it would lead to privatisation. And I think that the one thing Donald Trump could say that would help Jeremy Corbyn would be anything about the NHS. He hasn't gone there previously. He said it's not going to happen. But I think that's the type of intervention from a US president that could move the dial.
NHS still a big trigger for the election.
Well, So there's a poll out last week which had the Labour Party behind the Tories amongst likely voters on the NHS by 2 points. Now, that poll got you to choose between Labour, Tories, Liberal Democrat and the Brexit Party. So, today at the Labour rally, you had people cheering and shouting about Labour as the party of the NHS. Actually, they've got a job to do to reclaim that ground, and it's not just because of spending, it's because they don't have the fundamental trust in the brand that they need to re-earn. Trump, that is definitely, I totally agree with Katie, that is one way in which you could fire up the NHS as a debate in the election campaign. And Labour will want the election campaign to be about the NHS this winter because they have much more chance of building strength and credibility there over time. But they've actually got a job to do even to get significantly ahead.
So what do you think might happen tomorrow at the Brexit Party launch? Do you think there'll be a standing aside in certain seats? I mean, it was interesting today that when you have Ian Duncan Smith saying, well, we are the Brexit Party. So what will the tactic be, do you think, that Farage will deploy tomorrow?
What some in the Brexit Party have been pushing for and has been reported, Nigel Farage isn't denying, is this idea that they could zone in on, say, 20 seats, which would be Labour heartlands that they think are the most prone to, the most likely to move to the Brexit Party. I think were they to do that, I don't actually think that's that helpful for the Tory party. People say it'd be good because the Tories would have other seats to themselves. Well, first off, if you look at the Tory strategy, they really are focusing on Labour heartlands. And secondly, there are some in the Conservative Party who think the Brexit Party can be helpful to them because it could take votes away from Labour. So it gets slightly complicated there, but I don't think it would be such a simple win for the Tories.
Just very briefly, we've been talking about a dirty campaign, and that's what Corbyn said it was going to be, a dirty campaign. Do you see it becoming pretty torrid?
I think much like the snow and mush that we'll probably get to in December, it is likely to get quite gritty. Another pun on the weather there. But I think the challenge here is, will the message be clear enough by the time we get to December the 12th from each of the parties? We know where most of them stand now. Obviously, the Conservatives, we're getting Brexit done, but other things. Liberal Democrats for Remain. Labour, still unclear. They have to define their ground, and Brexit Party will find out tomorrow.
Thank you all very much indeed.
That is absolutely appalling. What is wrong with people?